I admit that all of these connections seem to stretch theory a bit far, to the breaking point and beyond for most people. While I am even more convinced that incorporating Lacanian psychoanalysis in architecture theory is generally a bad idea, I am even more enthusiastic about what could happen if the right crazy people came forward and took the risk. Although it might be bad for one's academic career, Lacanian theoretics provides perfect connections across media, periods of history, cultural differences, and scientific methodologies. Lacan insisted that psychoanalysis was not philosophy or art history, but we should be glad of this, since both of these disciplines have proven to be minefields of broken promises, where the more you learn, the more you are regarded as a threat to the established order of things. What architecture theory needs is a space to move around freely, but also a discipline that allows for reality checks and the relation to multiple levels of scientific reality. Lacanian psychoanalysis is not like a grocery store where you shop around for ingredients to cook up for the night's dinner. It's more the case that you have to grow your own food from scratch. Lacan gives you a framework but doesn't tell you how to fill it in. One thing to look for is how certain concepts come together in ways we don't expect. The challenge is to ask, if these 2, 3, or more things act in the same way, are they really the same thing working in different ways? This is the case with the space that seems to hover over any statement or conjunction. Just connecting things, just showing something, just making any object involves an internal circuit that shorts itself out, but the result is not zero. The thalamotropic effect is a spin, a split, a cut. The cut is step one. The space it seems to have canceled is the product, the result. Not just a vision of language into content and act of containing, but the simultaneity and self-conflicting relation of those two aspects. This antagonism makes Vertigo's thalamotrope of Judy and Madeline something more than just a merger of two different women. If it were, it wouldn't be such a problem for Scotty, whose love for Madeline, the woman who doesn't exist, to construct two voids, a void of a void, which is surely what Madeline does in her relationship to the dead great-grandmother Carlotta. This makes the Cretan paradox even more of a paradox. It's not a choice, but a forced choice, which means we are asked to consent to something imposed on us. Our consent is required. It's not enough that we are forced into a situation of having no options. This goes back to the university discourse's lesson that we don't enjoy using language, language enjoys using us. The fact that we are spoken is the whole idea of the unconscious. We had our grammar the wrong way around. We have stumbled across the idea that the forced choice of the thalamotrope constitutes a double, not a single void. This is something new in Lacanian theoretics, which expresses a double void, but only in terms of the standard torus. In an unpublished lecture, Lecture 13, in fact the missing part of the transcription done by Irish Lacanian Cormac Gallagher, available only in an original audio translation, does Lacan refer to this double void? The fact that we have discovered it by looking at this example of popular culture underscores the truth and significance of this detail. It is one thing for a major thinker to articulate an idea, quite another for a newcomer, an amateur, to find it by accident. But the idea of a double void, and consequent validity of the spindle torus, connects to the way that James Joyce articulated the figure of the Vesica Piscis in his major work Finnegan's Wake. Joyce flagged the double negative with two triangles inscribed into the intersection between the two circuits. We could have discovered it in other ways, for example in the story of Apollo and Daphne, where the hunter and the hunted cannot intersect because they live in two completely different spaces. Lacan himself cites this story in Seminar 8, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis, where he defines the double void in projective geometry terms as a surface of pain. Significantly for us, he says that this surface is the essence of architecture. He does not mean that architecture is painful. He connects this pain later in the same lecture with a function of anamorphosis and cites its role in the creation of the Baroque. Lacan wonders what anamorphosis was before it appeared in the form of distorted images and trick mirrors in the 16th century. Just as projective geometry was logically prior to Euclid, we would have to ask the same question: what was geometry called before it was Euclidean? Lacan has found the answer that has eluded mathematicians. It was called the uncanny, and it appears in the forms taken by mythic thought and the literature and art that grew from mythic thought. Our key to discovering this is the way anamorphosis takes different forms. Sometimes it's obvious, as when Daphne transforms herself into a laurel tree after discovering she's on the surface of no escape. This is a demonstration of the surface's other quality, non-orientation, the fact that she finds her other nature when she intersects herself, that is, when she runs out of places to run. Her aspect as a surface is not revealed until she tries to escape, but the surface exists only when it is the escape idea that needs it, when she wants to escape. But the surface immediately constructs a trap where escape is impossible. This weird fact that the space of escaping does not exist before the idea comes into our heads that we want to escape, but then the surface becomes a trap that prevents our escape, would be insignificant were it not for the fact that the very same idea has occurred to others in different ways, but always with the same set of artistic and poetic rules. This is obvious in the story of Apollo and Daphne, a myth that existed long before Ovid wrote up his report in his book on metamorphosis. His story was about the impossibility of the sexual relationship, something that Lacan would put in his own theories almost 2,000 years later. But they used the same argument. In between these two versions, we have another statement, this time by a painter who thought he was painting at the end of the world, and he decided that there was no escape from the apocalypse. He was convinced by his friend, the expert astrologer Luca Pacioli, that the end of the world was determined numerically by the number 3, but he would have to express this by a thalamotrope using the number 2. First, he put critical information on the back of his painting. He gave the date of the painting's completion, its vernissage or varnishing, in a ridiculously precise way. Not just the date, but the exact hour, April 11th, 1533, 4 p.m. Why? A vernissage is a celebration of a painting's completion, a private party the painter throws to friends who are the first to see the finished product. The idea of a private viewing is compounded by the precise and private point Holbein constructed for private viewing. The point is both a place and a date. The date seems to be, according to the author John North, the prediction by Pacioli that this would be the exact hour at the end of the world. Of course, if Holbein were painting this at the time, he would not be painting it, because the world would be in the process of total annihilation. But remember, there are lots of ways the world can end. The point of this ending was to bring things to a mathematical and astrological conclusion. So take 3 eons lasting 500 years each. Add to that the age of Christ at the time of crucifixion, 33, and use the day commemorating that crucifixion, Good Friday, which fell in 1533 on April 11th, a fortunate number also involved in 33. Then, on the recto side of the painting, put an anamorphic image that can be seen from only one spot. Align that spot directly beneath the crucifix, half hidden by the green curtain, and make the angles connecting these things 27 degrees, or 3 times 3 times 3. The anamorphic image can be seen from only one position, although many art historians don't get this exactly right. The skull is a classic reminder of death, a memento mori. But here it is telling us to turn the painting over. The painting is cut space in half, a space of representation and a space to look at that representation. Do we think of this as cutting 360 degrees into two parts, or do we treat the space of representation as a whole world in itself, and say that the space of viewing is also a whole world, where the representation is only a flat surface pretending to be a deep space? That would mean that turning the painting over amounts to adding 360 degrees to 360 degrees to get 720. Note that the sigma, or sum of digits, of all these numbers is 9. The place of the skull, Golgotha, is the place we occupy in order to be reminded that we too shall die. But it means that we will turn the page because we accept the flatness of the painting and the virtuality of what it represents, but then contradict ourselves. This turning is like the desire to escape. It automatically creates a space where escape is impossible. We submit to the power of a metaphorical transformation, but learn that this involves adding the space of the viewer to the viewed and seeing double. To be scientific about something, we look for corroboration. This is a test to see if the same idea can occur in an independent way, in a completely different form. What are we testing when we look at this painting, which is also a double portrait, even though both of the men we see are supposed to be the same guy? When we use this famous painting by Magritte titled "Not to be reproduced," a warning we are violating by reproducing it, we are taking note also of the title's irony, that the image in the mirror reflecting the man who wants to see himself reproduced is refusing to offer him that satisfaction. He would have left his 180-degree self reflected by another 180-degree self to confirm his existence, but the reflected image has refused. It has turned away. It has doubled this attempt to double. So now we have the same situation of having to add 360 degrees of the world where the demand is made to the 360 degrees of the world where the demand is refused. The two worlds meet and overlap at the point where the space becomes like the Vesica Pisces of the forced choice of the Cretan paradox. If it's true, it's false, and if it's false, it's true. Yet this origami overlap stabilizes the situation that would be upset if the demand had its way by suppressing the objection. Our question as critical thinkers has to do with whether or not the painter, Magritte, was aware of the situation. In this case, we have a remarkably reliable proof. Magritte puts a book on the sill beneath the mirror, a copy of Baudelaire's translation into French of Edgar Allan Poe's novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. Narrative becomes aventure in French, focusing on the events rather than the representation of events. Just as Holbein represents a space on one side and then refers to the representation on the other, there is a turn from acting to content and back again, a thalamotropic motion hinged at a line where the God has died. Jesus, at the top and bottom of the line, complains that he was duped. We are dupes of the 2D representation of 3D space. We say we see the ambassadors, the same way Magritte's subject would have said he sees himself in the mirror, but the mirror has other ideas. The conflict between expectations and actualities makes a palindrome. But the function of the palindrome is to maintain a balance, an idempotency, in the face of all disturbances. If we allow that a palindrome is literally a mirror image, then the idea of refusal is evident. It refuses to allow the claim of identity that the man seeks in his mirror image. It flips it around as if to say, I'm a mirror, damn it. Reversal is my business. I'm here to keep things balanced. With Vertigo, we get a story that may be the story that a dying man is dreaming, or we get a story about a man who escaped dying and is instead the victim of a scam to get him to bear false witness at an inquest. We think of Magritte's mirror refusing to bear false witness, and when we think of Holbein's painting of the ambassadors as witnessing its own destruction and universalizing this impossible moment numerically, the palindrome of Vertigo is the stability established by butterflying the possibility of the death dream with the denial of Scotty's death, a denial we make by accepting the story as a representation of someone living and not just dreaming he is alive. We are dupes of fiction in the second case, but in the first case we look directly into the dupe of the dream. When these versions combine, we get dizzy. We fall into the palindrome and discover how the other, more common image of the palindrome, the spiral, takes us into the geometry of forms that form themselves. We know these as what are called the metallic ratios, like the golden ratio. Although the spiral grows, it uses what came before to construct what is added next. The same, the idempotent, is maintained, and thanks to this, there is infinite addition. The split between two numbers, that is the idea of a ratio, as in an x over a y, as a split between x and y, opens up a full range of variability. When Scotty falls, he falls into a spiral that opens up a space of self-encounter and thalamotropic contradiction. We might say that this is also the logic of falling in love. When Lacan talks about the number 1 in his Seminar 9, calligraphy plays a part, where the European style is to use an upstroke and a downstroke. So the question of identity is the question of being identified by a single trait identified with the number 1, but the number 1 as a double stroke. The unary trait, the identifying mark, is a dual, but this relates to a cycle circulating from top to bottom, a rise and a fall. There's a funny fact about the numbers in our base 10 system. Each of the numbers has a separate etymology, which means that all the numbers came together to form a counting system only after they had had a career elsewhere doing other things. This is like the joke about the little girl who says, "My mother was from Manchester, my father from Leeds, and I was born in London. It's quite amazing how we all got together." This logic applies to 1, 2, 3, etc., which were all from somewhere else, and indeed it was amazing how they all got together. This amazing fact from the etymology of numbers in itself suggests that the whole logic of causality is reversed, that instead of there being one cause with many effects, there is, for any one effect, many causes that combine in it, like the reverse action film of water streaming back into the glass from which it is spilled. The story of the one is that it is a cut, a distinction. When we do interpretation by the cut, we are taking in mind what Lacan called a unary trait, which is not any one thing associated with something we have in mind, but a reversal of the cause and effect logic. Instead of one cause having many effects, like ripples spreading out from a rock thrown into the water, we have to imagine that any one effect, any phenomenon, has multiple causes. This is the context of the human subject. Conscious, we're aware of thinking to do something, of doing that something, then witnessing the effects. But this is not just only one of the many things going on. It is conscious to us only because we have reversed the logic of production. The ancient Greek word for subject, hypokeimenon, told a different story about the material ground beneath us that is not the fire at the bottom of the wheel of fortune or the heaven at the top, but the pivot in the center. Lacan intuits that, as with a torus, this center is at the same time on the edge of another circle in motion. We don't have to show the motion because the aim of this intersection is to keep the system still by resisting external stimuli. Every movement has a counter movement, every up a down, a palindrome idea. The hypokeimenon runs in two directions, or along two circuits at the same time, which means that Apollo will never catch Daphne, and that Daphne's escape has involved going to her ground, another concept related to the hypokeimenon. This is the German word related to going to one's ground, literally, zugrund gehen, literally to fall to pieces, equivalent to the Lacanian condition of the Corps morcelé, the broken-up body, but also the German phrase that Hegel used once, absoluter Gegenstoß, the counterattack or opposed movement that is absorbed into the self and which is the ground and essence of the subject. Hegel takes this to his idea that spirit is a bone, which is the location for Holbein's viewing point that we must physically take up in order to see the skull whose place we have taken, directly beneath the crucifix of the God that has just been put to death. This is a materialism that cannot be despiritualized, which we might as easily say is a spiritualism that cannot be dematerialized. Both cases point to the palindrome logic that is the thalamotrope that spins to keep the dreamer dreaming, the system in place, insulating itself from external and internal disturbance. This is the one of the one, the need for an upstroke and a downstroke, the misfortune of good fortune and the unluck of being lucky. This is also the need for the thinker to take an ersatz approach, knowing that error data will also lead to a lucky idea. Where amongst the debris of an experiment gone wrong, one finds the perfect tool or clue for solving the problem, something literally set in place by our very first question. Luck has a lot to do with Lacanian theoretics, in that the system of concepts of psychoanalysis has a very medieval structure, such as this memory device used by the mystic Raymond Lull, that maximizes the opportunities to make chance connections. This makes doing interpretation by the cut, as opposed to interpretation that follows single leads down linear paths, something very close to spinning a thalamotrope and making scholarly research into a kind of anamorphosis that realizes all of the possibilities of discourse. I have formulated this idea by borrowing from the 11th century astrological device known as the Zarja, used by a collectivity of Arabic, Jewish, Christian, and maybe even Zoroastrian scholars to discover, as they put it, as many causes possible for any one effect. They not only reversed the entropy of cause and effect, they actualized it in a system combining geometry and astronomy. This kind of synoptic thinking lies at the heart of the idea of the thalamotrope, or rather the thalamotropic idea lies at the heart of the Zarja. The point of this podcast has been to show off some of the advantages of Lacanian interpretation. Again, this is not an interpretation that simply replaces old meanings with new ones, which must then themselves be replaced, but an interpretation by the cut. Lacan presumes that anything appearing to be coherent and whole has an implicit cut, an axiomatic division that follows language's own radical bifold of act and content. When Vertigo opens, we get a backstory that explains why Scotty suffers from vertigo. That's only fair. But we also get an axiomatic space and a disappearing middle term. We forget that we never see Scotty pulled back to safety. We only see a policeman fall, a uniformed policeman to be exact, and we didn't think to consider that the uniform was a verb taking Scotty back into the form of a profile, a pronoun, a silhouette. Do we actually see Scotty fall, but the trauma of this has replaced him with a generic substitute? In this case, Scotty is dreaming the story of vertigo in the last seconds of his life. He is using the story to correct the defects of his life and limits of his personality, which we soon discover have to do with his inability to relate to women. Is it woman or women? This problem is put by taking a woman and uniforming her, by having Judy play Madeline, a profile or silhouette because she shows only one side of herself to Scotty. She wants to make him believe that she is facing another, Carlotta, who has already died. Madeline is having a death dream inside the story, so it's not impossible that Scotty is having a death dream outside the story. When Scotty tries to remake the Judy he finds on the streets of San Francisco into the Madeline who does not exist, he is asking this question in a way that we can understand because it's a part of the plot. Just as Scotty was conned, we are conned by this equally compelling scam, that if you turn vertigo over, you get a death dream. Lacanian criticism by the cut makes this kind of speculation possible. It is not possible to do it simply by captioning what happens on the screen. This is about structure of the story's imagination and the structure of our imagination. What happens outside and inside a story, thalamotropically, happens in a virtuality that is constructed to allow such things to happen. We think of virtuality as a prosthesis of our Euclidean perspectivalism. But there is a second virtuality that takes apart the pictures that the first virtuality tries to hold together. In pictorial terms, we see sequences as a succession of concentric enclosures, but the secondary virtuality of effectiveness violates the rules of this by connecting the inside and the outside. Because it violates Euclidean rules of order, we associate this with the dream or fantasy, but in fact we have engaged a geometry whose rules determine a system of connections that are comprehensive. The viewer is made a part of the viewed. The truth is, as Vico put it, something that we make. But we are not allowed to rest with this inclusiveness. Language speaks the speaker. Thought thinks the thinker. We are presumed by what we think are free choices. We do not have the luxury of self-reflection as independent masters of our materials. This option that is frequently proposed by phenomenology is turned upside down. Thinking involves accepting one's fate. In the rooftop chase scene, we see a concentric series. First the fugitive, then the uniformed officer, then the plainclothes detective. They come up the ladder looking for the limen calo of Dürer. This may actually be the point where death offers Scotty the opportunity to dream the story that he will play in, the role of the dupe. Then he will dream his own discovery of the truth. The cut comes when we realize that this scene will be able to curve in on itself, for the end of the story to be able to answer to the beginning, what Roland Barthes called the récit fort of strong narrative. The cut requires the récit fort because it requires self-intersection, a circling motion that Freud called Nachträglichkeit, and Lacanians rename the après-coup, the need to return to the point of trauma and relive it because the real cannot be refashioned into fantasy. Scotty does not have the option of thinking about death. He can only circle around it, or invent something that circles around it, a yarn, a tale, a spinning thalamotrope with an anamorphic image. It is possible to test the reality of the death dream medically, and reports of near-death experiences have set up experiments in operating rooms to allow those who have been clinically dead for a few seconds or minutes to prove that they have been out of their bodies. Scotty's death dream is a case of metempsychosis, the portability of the soul, which answers the mind-body problem in an unusual way, namely by giving idempotency and figure-ground reversal as an interpretation by the cut. This throws the question of how bodies are influenced by minds, and minds by bodies, into a different light. It asks, how come there is the distinction between mind and body in the first place, and how come it is so quickly suppressed? The promise of Lacan is that one may connect almost anything with anything else, without sacrificing the possibility of making a scientific as well as a poetically meaningful connection. The vast literature of psychoanalysis means that there are almost unlimited resources employing a remarkable variety of paradigms. Freud began his work in the 1880s and was active through the 1930s. Lacan took up Freud's theorizing in the 1930s and continued to nearly the 1980s. This century of thought is remarkably consistent, remarkably systematic, remarkably cumulative. It is possible to say what didn't work and what did. What remains as a central paradox, the answer is the death drive, as well as what seems to be settled law, which is Lacan's division of the domains of the real, symbolic, and imaginary. The unconscious continues to resist misinterpretations by psychology, just as the idea of the subject as such resists humanistic and hermeneutical revisionism. Psychoanalysis replaces what in the Middle Ages was called the ars topica, the art of topics. The point was not to list and compare things to understand, but to see what happened when things were brought into proximity to each other. The ideal of this was Giulio Camilo's theater of memory, accomplished under the sponsorship of Francis I in the 1550s. You should read his book to see how it worked, and what was in Camilo's head. Unfortunately, architecture is no longer interested in this, and those who do not see how Camilo's theater was a theater should take responsibility for this decision, which reveals a kind of monumental ignorance of history. What I offer is the promise that anyone who would choose to do such a thing might connect Camilo's project to Freud's and Lacan's, but also back to Pappus's discovery of projective geometry, and later the anamorphosis of painting in the 16th century. As Lacan recommended, one should ask, if projective geometry is logically prior to Euclid, what is historically prior? The answer is no big mystery, but it is not ever mentioned in architecture. It is the uncanny, which the most popular book on architectural uncanny neglected to notice. Instead, it was a dedication to starchitects who have no mastery of the uncanny and do not know what it has meant to history and thought. Architecture academics, like architects, have opted for fame over thinking. We must pay them no mind. My contribution to Lacanian literature has focused on geometry issues. I look for things that Lacanians have missed or not had time to take up. This includes going back to the original theorems that founded projective geometry, discovered by Pappus, Desargues, and Pascal, and thinking of connections to the non-numerical topographical calculus of George Spencer Brown. I am also fond of the paradox known as the Ship of Theseus, which is the logical problem of sorties, key to the evolutionary phenomenon of emergence. But the big surprise for Lacanians would be to find that Giambattista Vico anticipated many of Lacan's ideas about subjectivity some 200 years earlier. Almost no Lacanians know about Vico, and even fewer Vico scholars know or care much about Lacan. My audience will be able to be counted on the fingers of one hand with fingers left over. Popularity is not the point of thinking. Truth is the point of thinking. And if you can tell the truth, you can be sure that you have failed. Failure, however, is a good sign. You know you are on the right track if you fail, and you have new data, new error data, which frames new thought experiments. If this is your sort of thing, you will possibly like taking up psychoanalysis as a research paradigm, in the face of all of my recommendations to the contrary.